We will start by dealing with the question of what tithing actually was. One of the passages that deals with tithing quite thoroughly is Deuteronomy chapter 14 from verse 22 right up to verse 29. Let us first read Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 22. You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year.
According to you, what does the increase of your grain mean? A. It means everything one has. Or B. It means what one has improved or prospered in. Well, according to the dictionary, increase means advance, boost, hike, increment, jump, raise, rise. In other words, getting more than what one usually has. Israel had to tithe on what God had blessed them with agriculturally. They never had to tithe in times of decrease, such as during a famine or bad harvest, and there was a reason for that.
Let us read now from Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 23. And you shall eat before the Lord your God. Let me repeat that. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine, and your oil of the firstborn of your herds and your flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always.
So what did the Israelites do with their tithes? A. They gave it to the church. B. They gave it to the pastor. Or C. They ate their own tithes. Wow! Imagine that! The tither ate his or her own tithes before the Lord. You better read that again for yourself just to make sure.
You may say, well, that is then. Today you can't eat your money. Well, let us read now from verse 24 up to verse 26 and see what God commanded the Israelites concerning money when it comes to tithing. But if the journey is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses, and you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink, for whatever your heart desire. You shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household.
So what did the Israelites do when they stayed too far from the place where God had commanded to eat their tithes? They sold their tithes for money. What then were they to do with this money once they arrived at the place where God would place his name? They were to buy whatever their hearts desired, for food or for drink. What were they to do with what they bought? You better go and read this again for yourself. They were to eat and feast before the Lord. In other words, tithes were a feast to celebrate God's increased blessing on Israel's agriculture. It was not money that was given for church buildings, programs, and salaries. The question you might be asking at this point is, were the Levites and the priests not supposed to live from the tithes? Well, let us read further from Deuteronomy chapter 14 from verse 27 right up to 29. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. And at the end of every third year you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levites, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates, may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands which you have done.
Here are some important questions that we need to look at from this passage of Scripture. First of all, which of the tithes were not eaten by the tither, but were set aside to be given away, and when were these tithes given? Was it perhaps given every month, perhaps every year, or was it every third year? This passage of Scripture shows us that the tithes of the first 2 years were eaten before the Lord by the tither. It was only the third year's tithe that was given away.
The next question is, to whom was the third year's tithe given? Was it given to the church or the pastor, or was it at all given to the Levites and the priests? Neither. The third year's tithe was distributed among the strangers, the orphans, and the widows, and only a portion of the third year's tithe came to the Levites. Can you believe it? Only a portion of the third year's tithe came to the Levites. Most of the tithe went to those who are not in a position to provide for themselves.
Another passage of scripture teaches and confirms this, and it is found in Deuteronomy chapter 26 verse 12 right up to verse 13. When you have finished laying aside all the tithe of your increase in the third year, the year of tithing, and have given it to the Levites, the strangers, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your gates and be filled, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the holy tithe from my house, and also have given them to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widows, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. We have not transgressed your commandments, nor have we forgotten them.
So again, was it the tithe of the decrease or the increase that the tither tithed on? It was from the increase, of course. Israel did not tithe when there was a famine, because tithing was a celebration of God's increased blessing. It's an amazing revelation one gets when one reads what's actually written in the scriptures, as opposed to what others would want you to read into them.
According to this passage then, what tithes were given away? Once again we read it was the third year's tithe, the holy tithes, because the other 2 years were eaten by the tither before the Lord. Finally, do we read in this passage that the tithes were only given to the Levites? No, it was also given to the strangers, the orphans, and the widows. At this point, we have only read that the Levites, along with the strangers, orphans, and widows, lived from the third year tithe. How then did the priests receive tithes? This time we will be reading from Numbers chapter 18 verse 25 right up to verse 28. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, When you take from the children of Israel the tithes which we have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Lord, a tenth of the tithe. And your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor, and as the fullness of the winepress. Thus you shall also offer a heave offering to the Lord from all your tithes which you receive from the children of Israel. And you shall give the Lord's heave offering from it to Aaron the priest.
So then, who was responsible to tithe to the Lord in order for the priest to live from it? A. The church members. B. The Israelites. C. The priests. Or D. The Levites. It was the Levites and not the rest of Israel who were to give tithes to the priests. The Levites had to give a tenth of the portion of tithes they received from the rest of Israel to Aaron and his descendants, who would be the priests.
If that is the case, then what is the difference between the priest and the Levites? That is vitally important to understand if we are to understand biblical tithing. You might recall that God commanded in Exodus chapter 13 that the first fruit of all of Israel, whether it be agriculture, livestock, and the firstborn sons of Israel, are to be dedicated to God. This they had to do because God delivered them from the Egyptians using the 10th plague by killing the firstborn from all of Egypt, man and livestock.
Then, in Numbers chapter 3, verses 40 right up to 51, God commanded that instead of all the tribes of Israel having to offer up the firstborn son to do service for God, that the one tribe of Israel, the Levites, would substitute the firstborn of Israel. The Levites, in place of the firstborn of all the tribes of Israel, had to serve God by the tabernacle and later on by the temple in Jerusalem. Aaron, Moses' brother, who, by the way, was from the Levite tribe, was chosen by God to be the priest for Israel. So from that time on, Aaron's descendants would be the Levitical priesthood. The rest of the Levites were then in service to the priests of Aaron's descendants. For that reason, the Levite tribe had to pay a tenth of the tithes they received from the other tribes on the third year and gave it to the descendants of Aaron, the priests of Israel. This leads us to the next very important question. Who then was responsible to bring the tithes into the storehouse of God? And for that matter, what was the storehouse of God?
Jerusalem was the city that God placed his name, as we read in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 36. And so it was there where Israel was to celebrate the Feast of Tithing. It was also in Jerusalem where the house of God, or the temple of God, was built. The temple of God had storerooms all around the temple which were called the storehouse.
Let us now look at who was responsible to supply the house of God and in what way they were to supply the house of God. As we read this, Keep in mind that the first fruit offerings were to be given as a remembrance that God delivered Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, by destroying the firstborn of livestock and the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. Tithes, on the other hand, were a celebration of God's increased blessing over Israel's agriculture. The first fruit offerings and the tithes are therefore completely different and were also given differently.